John P. Martin was a Union partisan a few counties to the north and was a participant in a family feud a couple of years earlier which almost wiped the entire Underwood family off the face of the earth. He and the remaining few supporters that remained in that county moved to the south and took up roots in the local community here in Rowan County. Now, because the local said he was an alcoholic and he was a moonshiner, they really despised him in his position as county clerk and as a businessman. By 1877, his business was shut down because he gambled too much, at least that was the local rumor, but the sheriff was on his side, something that naturally the locals detested. And he had a lot of supporters throughout town who conspicuously seemed to be from outside the local community. And it was this that really started the feud. And this is the grave of Solomon Bradley, whose death actually sparked the feud. See, the sheriff at that time was a supporter of John P. Martin, who was a Republican, but Solomon Bradley was wanted for legitimate arrest, and when they realized that nobody would arrest the best friend of the leader of the Republican faction, the local town marshal, Floyd Tolliver, went and arrested him himself. However, because Solomon Bradley was hanging out with his friend John P. Martin at a local bar, Tolliver walked up and said, "Listen, Martin doesn't have to be a big deal. I'm arresting him. I've got a warrant out." And apparently, Martin said no. Solomon wouldn't go without a fight. And it seems like Tolliver pulled a gun and started firing wildly, killing Bradley and wounding John P. Martin pretty seriously. Now, what's so crazy about that is that both Tolliver and John Martin, in spite of their differences, were good friends and actually knew each other and both supported the Underwood faction in that feud that wiped out the Underwood family just a couple counties to the north only a few years prior. So this created bad blood between the families, but more importantly, bad blood between the two different political factions in the immediate post-Civil War environment in Kentucky. The Courier-Journal published an article on August 5th, 1884 that contradicts this version of the beginning of the feud. Initial reports seem to indicate that Solomon Bradley was a law-abiding citizen who tried to stop a fight between William Trumbo and H.G. Price. This fight drew a crowd, and in the fracas, Price, Martin, and Allen Sutton were slightly wounded, Ad Scissorman was fatally wounded, and when Bradley tried to stop the fight, he was shot in the neck and died instantly. It's easy to see these shifting narratives in the papers over time. It sounds like a town fight. Bradley was shot through the head via his ear, Scissorman was shot above the collarbone, some say by Sheriff John Day, Martin was pistol whipped, and Bradley was shot by Floyd Tolliver. The paper was already filling with accusations, including that John P. Martin killed his friend Solomon Bradley accidentally with a bullet that was really meant for Floyd Tolliver. Floyd Tolliver and John P. Martin tried to make amends and bury the hatchet, rekindling an old friendship. Sadly, by this point, the rift was too great, and beyond that, they were political rivals. So in December of 1884, just before the matter had been settled, they ran into each other in a local bar. Martin walked up, his pistol concealed in his jacket, and fired through the cloth, killing his old pal. In his dying breaths, Floyd Tolliver made his friends swear they would kill Martin, which many took to mean his supporters as well, because they were political rivals. And of course, in the aftermath of this, the entire town divided along party and personal family lines, and the brother of Floyd Tolliver, Craig, became the town marshal. Immediately, John P. Martin skipped the county and went into exile elsewhere in Kentucky, knowing for a fact that he could be very easily killed and his murder covered up by local law enforcement. Buried here is H.M. Keaton, another victim of Bloody Rowan. When John Martin was whisked off to another county for his own protection, murder became commonplace. And near Christmas of 1885, Keaton was arrested alongside his notoriously violent friend, John Trumbo. He would die in custody a few weeks later, the sheriff being in firm Republican control and a supporter of the Martins. And sure enough, you've got Trumbo family descendants named after John Trumbo buried in the same plot as John P. Martin. And we just so happened to come across the family plot of John M. Trumbo. He might have actually been the one killing people. Now, John Trumbo was an explosive man, arrested often and naturally drawn to the chaos of the Rowan County War. he and John Witcher, who is buried here, were drinking one night and got into an argument. Witcher said that he could gut Trumbo before he could even draw his pistol, and Trumbo challenged him by pulling his gun, which accidentally misfired and shot him in the belly, and he died quickly after. In response to this increasing violence, Craig Tolliver sought out John Martin's friend, Daniel Boone Logan, and demanded to murder the man who took the life of his brother. The town was bubbling over, and eventually the two boys would be executed by the Tolliver faction. But this is J.N. Witcher, who was killed by John Trumbo. And a little bit of a better explanation for the lead up to the murder of the two Logan boys. Imagine this. You're the town marshal, and you hear that your friend is in a bar and is murdered by a supporter of your opponent who had just killed your brother. However, when the sheriff brings him in, he says, oh, well, the guy that he killed, even though he's your best friend, he was talking smack, and he pulled a gun, and the gun accidentally misfired, so I'm going to let him out of jail. And that was John Trumbo. So naturally, having lost his brother and his good friend, the town marshal marched into the nearest person he could find to his opponent, John Martin, who was a town judge, and demanded to murder whoever took the life of his brother, Floyd Tolliver. Well, the judge said, Martin's out of town, and naturally, he began to target the two boys, the two Logan boys, who were the sons of the judge, the friend of John Martin. Probably also because they let the Trumbo guy off the hook for killing his friend, and the man who killed his brother, again, was out of pistol range. The murders of Billy and Jackie Logan were a watershed moment for the Rowan County War. At that point in time, John Martin had killed a Tolliver brother, and his brother, Craig Tolliver, was a lawman, a town marshal. And because John Martin had already left town and all authorities feared a lynch mob, the town marshal got together a posse of his own and sought out anybody who was very closely related to John Martin. And he found the two sons of a local Republican judge. He and the posse got together and executed them, and it could be said maybe they were involved in illicit activities, maybe they were involved in moonshine, maybe they even reached for their gun. However, it was very obvious that Craig Tolliver just wanted to kill somebody who was very close to the man who murdered his brother. And this would be the turning point for the Rowan County War, in which families took sides and dug in their heels. And this is how you get to the Logan boys' graves. Basically, it's back here in the woods, and you have to hop the bridge on the opposite side of the river, cross over, come down from the guardrail, cross the fence, and then come here through the woods, and you can't miss it. It's in the middle of a clearing. Now, Billy and Jackie Logan were just boys, and when the Tolliver faction seized the county, a reign of terror resulted. Their clan, gaining support from Democrats and politics, forged documents demanding John Martin's extraction back to the county. He was shot and badly wounded on the train back, but managed to make it to the town's hotel, dying 2 days later with his wife by his side. Sadly, the war was far from over, and he would have one of the most merciful deaths, surrounded by family and friends. Craig Tolliver and the Democrat faction ruled through intimidation, and he was quickly appointed town marshal. The sheriff was a Republican and sided with the Martin faction. The war continued until 1887, when a small faction led by Hiram and Logan Pigman shot and killed the marshal, Craig. This was the second Tolliver brother to be assassinated. He didn't go down without a fight, and the shooting killed 3 others out of the 60 posse men involved. John P. Martin, the leader of the Republican Martin faction, is buried up here. After this, immediately the violence took an uptick and people began dying left and right throughout the county. And for a while, the sheriff was on the Martin side until a turning point was reached and a new sheriff was elected to show his neutrality. Now, this sheriff kind of set off to assassinate anybody who would stir up this family feud, and one of the boys who died, ironically, was a friend of the Martin faction, a 19-year-old boy named William or Billy Logan, who died in a shootout. And very sadly, even though this happened in 1886, he lingered for several weeks after being shot, and his agonizing death further galvanized the community, and more violence would come after his death. Hiram Cooper was killed in that standoff with Craig Tolliver. See, because of family alliances, he was expected to join with the Democrat Tolliver faction led by Craig Tolliver, who was the leader of that group and also the marshal of the town. Now, the sheriff at that time was Republican and had come in with orders to arrest the marshal, Craig Tolliver. That shootout killed 2 people, and there is a little bit of disagreement about how Hiram Cooper and Jay Tolliver actually died. Some reports said that they were hiding in a local hotel and that men sent by the sheriff went in their room and executed both of them while they were begging for their lives. But other newspaper reports say that they were both very heavily armed and actually were fighting at the time they were killed. So it's not really known how they died, but you can see how deaths like these would further fan the flames of the feud. By September, the Rowan County War was in full swing, and revenue agents raided the still house of the man buried here, Everett Elfrey, only to find him with a fist-sized hole in his head. They theorized he killed himself and gave lurid descriptions to the press. In reality, however, the county was still partially controlled by the Democrat Tolliver faction, who identified the Martin faction with Moonshiners. This was partly true because there was no other legal way to make money in Rowan County as a Republican or as a Martin supporter once the Tollivers had control of local businesses. So I think basically this was a search party to root out all the Moonshiners, and they probably killed Mr. Elfrey here, who's buried in his family plot at the Elfrey Cemetery. And Elfrey had a huge extended family. You can see most of their gravestones have washed away because they weren't exactly the wealthiest of people, but they're buried in a large line right along here. Some of them unidentified. Most of these are unidentified in the cemetery. The day after that moonshiner named Elfrey was found with a fist-sized hole in the back of his skull, James Keaton was likewise assassinated. 1 month prior, he and 3 of his friends were ambushed on their way to testify about what they saw because they were present at the murder of the Logan boys. They said that Craig Tolliver, the town marshal, had actually pulled the trigger. The masked men opened fire after ambushing the 3 men who were on their way back to town and testifying, wounding several but making absolutely sure to kill the Martin boy, the son of the dead leader of the Republican faction. A month afterwards, James Keaton, who had testified with them, was also dead at age 36. I haven't found exact sources for how he died, but considering he testified at trial and was nearly ambushed by 3 masked men on the way back from testifying, and was killed a day after a local Republican moonshiner was killed, leads me to think that it was a highly targeted killing. Coon Logan, who's buried here, was a friend of Hiram Pigman's, who's buried on the back left. He was charged with Ku Kluxing, and that's the word that the papers use, and got into a shootout which claimed 2 lives. The new town marshal, who was chosen supposedly for his neutrality, aimed to shake some of the sectarian violence from the county. The Republican marshal and his posse attempted arrests at the house of a few of the men, who then ran upstairs and fired buckshot back at him, striking the marshal in the shoulder. Immediately, the marshal began to pile straw up in the doorway and held a lighter up to it, saying, "You either come out or you're burned out." When he threatened to fire the house, 2 boys ran out front and were immediately shot by the marshal, and the rest were taken into custody, including Coon Logan. Logan died a few months later in jail, but the paper never specifies how, a common factor towards the end of the war. Now, because he died, I think, from an infection, his friend Pigman killed himself just a few weeks later. However, if he were assassinated in jail, it could be that they were tying up loose ends and ending the feud where it was by killing him and assassinating Pigman, buried on the back left, and leaving his body on the railroad tracks, claiming he killed himself, grieving the loss of his friend Coon Logan. And this is the grave of Hiram Pigman, who had killed the Democrat town marshal Craig Tolliver. And they said that he committed suicide about a year after he killed the marshal, but a lot of things lead me to question this. I think that after the war had concluded, there were a few more assassinations to wrap up loose ends. It had been a year, and he supposedly walked onto a train tracks and was crushed by the oncoming train, but his friend, Coon Logan, is buried right over here, and he died only a few weeks earlier, probably from an infection because he had just gotten into a shootout with that sheriff. Now, no sources mention specifically how Coon Logan died, but he was either killed in custody or died of that infection. And it was either an assassination in prison, if he was killed in custody, or just an infection, which may have led his friend Pigman to commit suicide at the tragic toll the war had taken. Daniel Boone Logan, a prominent Republican politician in Rowan County, and also John P. Martin's friend who lost his two cousins to the marshal, survived the war and outlived most of the participants, passing away of old age in 1919. He was by that time known to have financed the regulators and fought an uphill battle to end hostilities.